there's still one of the question sheets out. Are you still looking at it? Anybody? So, yeah, brought down 6 of them. Oh, I got them all back. Thank you. All right, sorry. Okay, so this is a question about the function of LH in the male. Okay? All right, try to pick an answer if you haven't already. I tried to count kind of quickly. I think there was 28. There we go. Now I should have it. All right. So most of you said number 4, testosterone, and that's correct. That's what LH does. So LH is released by the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and LH stimulates the production of testosterone by the interstitial cells. Okay, here's another one. Okay, in the presence of androgen binding protein, testosterone stimulates what? And again, this is in the male. Oops, I gotta activate this. There we go. All right, let's take a look at the answers for this second review question. Most of you said spermatogenesis, and that is correct. So FSH in males stimulates the production of an androgen binding protein within the seminiferous tubules, and that binds to testosterone, and testosterone stimulates spermatogenesis. Okay, so today we're going to start chapter 28, the female reproductive system. I'm not going to go into the anatomy of the female reproductive system very much because we covered that pretty well, I think, in lab. So mostly today what I'm going to do is talk about the hormonal regulation of the sexual cycle in women. But let's just do a quick review of the female reproductive system. So the primary sex organ in the female is the ovary, which is retroperitoneal. It remains attached to the dorsal body wall in the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's the organ that produces the oocytes that are, when they're mature, they become secondary oocytes. That's a cell that can be fertilized by the mature sperm cell. And so in the female, on an average of about 28 days, which is the length of the cycle, one oocyte is released about the midpoint of the cycle in a process called ovulation. And that oocyte is usually taken up into the oviduct or uterine tube. And it gets taken up into that due to the action of cilia that line the inside of the oviduct. Now, occasionally, the oocyte doesn't get taken up into the oviduct. And so if it doesn't get taken up to oviduct, sometimes then it will just go into the peritoneal cavity where eventually it will disintegrate. Okay? So fertilization usually occurs in the oviduct, and then as the early embryo is dividing to form a hollow ball of cells called a blastocyst, that embryo moves down gradually into the uterus, where it implants in the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, and that's where it remains until the end of the gestation period when delivery occurs. So once labor begins and labor and delivery occurs, then the fetus is pushed out of the uterus due to the action of the smooth muscles in the walls of the uterus, and those contractions are under the control of a positive feedback system that is triggered by the stretching of the cervix, and stretching of the cervix stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin causes strong contractions of smooth muscle. Those contractions cause more stretching of the cervix, more oxytocin is released, and so levels of oxytocin gradually increase, contractions increase until the baby is delivered through the vagina, which serves as the birth canal. Okay. Now, in addition to those contractions of the uterus, though, in order to push the baby out of the uterus and the vagina, it does take some work on the part of the mother. It takes some work using skeletal muscles, using the abdominal muscles. So it does take a lot of work, and there's a reason why they call it labor. Okay. All right. So those are the main parts of the female reproductive tract. So we went over. I briefly went over the different stages of oogenesis, which occur within a structure called a follicle, which is made up of an oocyte surrounded by granulosa cells or follicle cells. This development of the oocyte goes through several stages within the follicle, and you can also track different stages of the follicle, which is called folliculogenesis. So development of the oocyte actually begins even before the birth of the female. And so prior to birth, the cells that begin the process of oogenesis, which are diploid cells, are called oogonia. And at a very early stage of development, all of the oogonia begin the very first phase of meiosis 1, which is called prophase 1. And once prophase 1 occurs, then the oogonia are converted into primary oocytes. And once those cells are converted to primary oocytes, they no longer have an ability to divide. So women are born with all of the primary oocytes that they're ever going to have. Okay? It's usually enough, though, to last their reproductive age. So, following childhood and puberty, once the hypothalamus starts secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone, every cycle, which averages about 28 days, anywhere from 20 to 25 primordial follicles begin developing. And the primary oocyte takes up nutrients that are produced by the granulosa cells, and the primary these 20 to 25 primary oocytes begin to enlarge. They get larger as they take up nutrients. So about 140 days after these primordial follicles begin to grow, the follicle is surrounded by a single layer of cuboidal granulosa cells. And that stage is called a primary follicle. Okay? So these primary follicles are developing during the first half of the menstrual cycle of the female. That's called the follicular phase. That's when the follicles are developing. Whoops. Okay. Then, about 170 days after the primordial follicles are activated to begin development, the granulosa cells start multiplying. And the granulosa cells go from having a single layer of cells to more than one layer of cells. And when more than one layer of cells form, eventually several layers will form, then that follicle is called a secondary follicle. But the oocyte in the secondary follicle is not a secondary oocyte yet, because it doesn't become a secondary oocyte until just a few hours before ovulation. Okay, because right before ovulation there's a surge of LH, and that surge of LH causes the completion of meiosis I, which converts the primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte. So even though it's called a secondary follicle, that oocyte is still a primary oocyte. Okay. Then about 60 days before ovulation, the secondary follicle develops into a tertiary follicle, or a mature follicle, which has a large fluid-filled space that surrounds the oocyte. That fluid-filled space is called the antrum. And so, in total, it takes more than one menstrual cycle for a follicle to develop. In fact, it takes many menstrual cycles for a follicle to develop. It takes a total of about 290 days for a follicle to develop. So each follicle that releases a secondary oocyte during each average 28-day cycle actually started developing several months beforehand, because it takes 290 days. So every 28 days, a new cohort begins to develop, anywhere from 20 to 25 follicles, but it takes several cycles for those to mature. So at any one point in time in the ovary, you've got follicles that are going to be at different stages of development. And every month, generally only one follicle matures. One follicle becomes dominant over the others, and all the other follicles in each cohort eventually disintegrate. And so ordinarily, only one follicle matures, and ordinarily you only get one secondary oocyte that's released at ovulation. So about the midpoint of the reproductive cycle in the female, the mature follicle starts absorbing water, and the walls of the follicle start to thin, and it pushes out on the surface of the ovary, and there's a little nipple-like structure that appears on the follicle called stigma. And eventually that stigma will rupture, and the fluid from the follicle will be released along with the secondary oocyte. So the same signal that causes ovulation also causes what's called the maturation of the oocyte. And that the maturation refers to the completion of meiosis I, which produces the secondary oocyte. So humans are kind of the exception to the general rule, in that in humans, meiosis II is usually not completed, and I say usually because there's always an exception somewhere. But normally, meiosis II isn't completed until after fertilization. And when the secondary oocyte is fertilized, at that point it's a zygote. It's no longer a secondary oocyte. And so technically, the human, in human oogenesis, there is no such thing as a mature ovum or a mature egg, secondary oocyte. So when that secondary oocyte is released, it's released, some of the granulosa cells stay around the secondary oocyte. That layer of granulosa cells is called the corona radiata. And that is one of 3 layers of the egg that the sperm cells have to penetrate in order to fertilize the egg. And there's also another layer inside, there's a clear layer inside that corona radiata called the zona pellucida, which is made up of 3 different kinds of glycoproteins. That's another barrier that the sperm have to penetrate. And then finally, the sperm have to go through the plasma membrane of the secondary oocyte in order to fertilize the egg. So those enzymes that are in that little acrosome, that little vesicle that kind of forms like a stocking cap over the head of the sperm, that acrosome contains enzymes that allow it to dissolve its way through the corona radiata and then into the zona pellucida. It actually binds to a glycoprotein called ZP3, and that actually stimulates the secondary oocyte to begin dividing. Okay, that's a stimulus that it needs to start dividing. So the only thing the sperm contributes to the egg is its nucleus. All the other parts of the cell that's needed for the embryo comes from the secondary oocyte. So, like all the mitochondria in a person are inherited from that person's mother because there's mitochondria in the egg that can divide and multiply. The sperm does not contribute any mitochondria ordinarily. Now, I've heard of 1 or 2 exceptions that have been found in humans, but it's extremely rare for that to happen. 99.99% of the time, all the mitochondria come from the mother because they're already found in the egg. Okay. Then once ovulation occurs and the secondary oocyte is released, the empty follicle turns into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum begins secreting both progesterone and estrogen, but mostly progesterone. And that progesterone is needed to maintain the endometrium of the uterus. And if pregnancy occurs, then the embryo produces a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG for short. And HCG is an LH-like substance, and it causes the corpus luteum to be maintained, so it doesn't automatically disintegrate after about 10 days. So that corpus luteum keeps producing progesterone if pregnancy occurs. If pregnancy doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum starts breaking down spontaneously after about 10 days. And when it starts breaking down, then progesterone levels fall. When progesterone levels fall, then the endometrium of the uterus is sloughed off along with a small amount of blood as the menses, or the menstrual flow. And so when that occurs, when the corpus luteum breaks down, the corpus luteum turns into a corpus albicans, which is a white-colored body in the ovary. So the corpus luteum is yellow in color in an unstained ovary or an unstained section. Corpus albicans is a white-colored body in an unstained ovary. Now, there's also another structure that can be seen inside the ovary. I haven't mentioned yet. I don't think I mentioned this in lab either. As I said, ordinarily every cycle only one follicle matures and releases an oocyte. All the other follicles, those other 20 to 24 follicles, they disintegrate. And when they disintegrate, they become what's called an atretic follicle. So an atretic follicle is basically a follicle that doesn't mature, and instead all the other follicles except the one dominant one disintegrate and they become atretic follicles. All right, so sexual cycle in the female averages 28 days, but it can range anywhere from 20 to 45 days. So that's what makes it difficult to predict the exact day of ovulation. And some people use that as a birth control method, but it's not very reliable because the length of the cycle can vary from one cycle to the next. So there's kind of a joke that people may say about people who use the rhythm method. Rhythm method is where they try to predict the time of ovulation and they just abstain from having sex during that time. There's kind of a joke about that. What do you call people? Anybody know? What do you call people who couples who use the rhythm method for birth control? What do they call those people? Not gamblers. It's kind of a form of gambling because it's not very reliable. They call them parents because it's not very reliable. Also, another reason the rhythm method is not very reliable is because it's suspected, and this does occur in other animals besides humans, but it's suspected that some women may be induced ovulators, which means they ovulate in response to the sexual intercourse. So when they have sexual intercourse, that's a stimulus that causes them to ovulate. Well, if that happens that way, then you could get pregnant anytime. And there are some animals or some other mammals that are known to be induced ovulators. So the females will ovulate after the act of copulation. And that's just an adaptation that ensures that fertilization and continuance of the species can occur. Okay, so the cycle in women actually begins at the end of menstruation, at the end of the period of time when that lining of the uterus is sloughed off along with a small amount of blood. It started the first day of menstruation. Okay, so the first day of menstruation is actually day one of the cycle, not the end of menstruation. Okay, we usually think of it kind of at the end when the uterus starts regrowing the endometrium, but actually reproductive physiologists consider the first day of menstruation as the first day of the cycle. And that menstruation then takes up about the first 3 to 5 days of the menstrual cycle. And so following that time, the uterus replaces the lost tissue by mitosis, and another cohort of follicles, which is not going to mature for another 290 days, begins during that time. Then once ovulation occurs, about the middle point of the cycle, then the empty follicle turns into a corpus luteum. The next 2 weeks of the cycle are called the luteal phase, and that's when the corpus luteum is releasing mostly progesterone. Progesterone causes the endometrium to become more glandular and start secreting nutrients to support the early embryo when it implants, and it also maintains the endometrium so that the endometrium doesn't slough off. If pregnancy, though, doesn't occur the endometrium starts breaking down in the last 2 days of the luteal phase. And then menstruation begins and a new cycle starts at that point. So that's kind of a description of of what's called the menstrual cycle. It describes what's happening in the uterus. You can also describe the reproductive cycle in a female in reference to what's happening in the ovary with the oocyte. And so there's 3 main parts of the ovarian cycle. The first half is the follicular phase, when the follicles are stimulated to develop, or a new cohort of follicles are developing. At the midpoint of the cycle, you have ovulation, and then about the last 2 weeks are the luteal phase. So the follicular phase extends from the beginning of menstruation until ovulation, which is day 1 through 14 in an average 28-day cycle. The pre-ovulatory phase is from the end of menstruation until ovulation. And that's the most variable part of the cycle, and that's why it's difficult to predict the date of ovulation. Preparation for the follicular phase, though, begins in one of the previous cycles, and it actually takes a total of 290 days for complete development. And it's for that reason that usually the first 2 or 3 menstrual periods of adolescent females are usually anovulatory, which means there's no oocyte is released. And it's because it takes 290 days for those follicles to completely develop. So the first couple of cycles, usually it's not possible for pregnancy to occur, usually, most of the time. So shortly after ovulation, a new cohort of preantral follicles descends from the cortex deep into the ovary, and they begin to grow, and eventually they develop an antrum. Okay, so the hormonal events that stimulate this development of a new cohort of follicles starts out with the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone then stimulates the release of FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone. And that stimulates continued growth of the cohorts that had already started developing in previous cycles, but it mainly stimulates the growth of a dominant follicle, and all the others disintegrate as atretic follicles. And so FSH stimulates the granulosa cells of the antral follicles to secrete estradiol, which is the primary estrogen. And estradiol causes an upregulation of receptors for FSH, LH, and estrogen, and it stimulates the release of inhibin, which inhibits the release of FSH. And so the dominant follicle then becomes mature, and all the other ones degenerate. Now, actually, I think this will make more sense if we look at just a little bit. We'll look at a diagram of the feedback cycles in the female reproductive system. So ovulation occurs about the midpoint of the cycle, about day 14. It results from the rupture of the mature follicle and the release of the so-called egg and the attendant cells. Those are the granulosa cells of the corona radiata. Just before ovulation, there's a surge of LH and a lesser increase in FSH by the anterior pituitary. That surge of LH that occurs about the midpoint of the cycle causes the primary oocyte in the mature follicle, in the dominant mature follicle, to complete meiosis 1, which results in the production of the first polar body, and it also causes the follicle to rupture, which results in ovulation. So this kind of shows the change in the concentrations of the different hormones that are involved in regulation of the female reproductive cycle. And it is a lot more complicated in the male because these hormones are not released kind of at an even pace throughout the cycle like they are in the male. So the hormone that actually begins the process at puberty is gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So when the corpus luteum begins breaking down and progesterone levels fall, that drop in progesterone removes the negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that causes that allows the hypothalamus to increase its secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And these hormones, by the way, they're not secreted at the same levels throughout the day. They actually are secreted in spikes, which one of the reasons it makes it difficult to study because they're not released the same throughout the day. They tend to be released in pulses. So those elevated levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone stimulate the release of both FSH as well as LH. And the FSH, that stimulates, FSH stimulates the continued development of one of the earliest, one of the cohorts of follicles. And in response to, when those follicles begin developing, the granulosa cells then, in response to the increase in LH, that causes an increase in production of estradiol by the granulosa cells. So estradiol levels gradually increase. The increase in the estradiol levels start causing the endometrium to proliferate, causes the cells to start multiplying by mitosis. That causes the endometrium to thicken. And then, just a short time before ovulation, there's actually a positive feedback effect that causes levels of LH to very quickly increase. And so there's a surge of LH you can see on that top graph. That surge of LH causes the maturation of the primary oocyte, form a secondary oocyte in the first polar body, and it also causes ovulation. It causes the release of the secondary oocyte. Okay, following the release of the secondary oocyte, then the empty follicle turns into the corpus luteum. Levels of progesterone rise. That causes the endometrium to become more glandular and start secreting nutrients, which supports the early embryo when it implants. But if pregnancy doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum spontaneously breaks down after about 10 days. Progesterone levels fall. When progesterone levels fall, then the endometrium starts breaking down, resulting in menstruation. So due to these drops in progesterone and estrogen, that removes the negative feedback on the hypothalamus and pituitary, and so gonadotropin-releasing hormone levels start increasing. That causes an increase in FSH, LH, and that begins a new cycle. Okay, so this is a little video that I found on YouTube that kind of goes through the hormonal events of the menstrual cycle along with how some of the hormonal contraceptives work. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
In this lecture, we're going to cover the menstrual cycle, as well as the pharmacology of hormonal contraceptives. So let's get right into it. The menstrual cycle is defined by the regular, repetitive monthly occurrence of ovulation throughout a female's reproductive life. The normal menstrual cycle results from a complex feedback system involving the hypothalamus, pituitary, ovary, and uterus. The average length of the cycle is 28 days, but this can vary between individuals and from one cycle to the next. According to convention, the cycle is divided into two phases of approximately 14 days each. The first half of the cycle is called the follicular phase. At the beginning of this phase, the hypothalamus sets the beat for the menstrual cycle by the pulsatile release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH for short. GnRH then acts on the anterior pituitary gonadotropic cells and causes them to release two hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH for short, and luteinizing hormone, LH for short. Here we're going to use a graph to illustrate the day-to-day changes of these and other hormones in plasma that play a role in the menstrual cycle. Now, once released from the pituitary, FSH travels to the ovary, where it binds to immature eggs called oocytes, thereby initiating their maturation. As the ovarian follicles grow, they become surrounded by layers of so-called theca and granulosa cells. At this point, LH joins the party and stimulates LH receptors expressed as theca cells, causing them to produce androgens, which then diffuse into granulosa cells that in response to FSH binding to the FSH receptors, convert them to estrogens. Going back to our graph, as a result of these events, in the first week of the cycle, we'll see slightly elevated levels of FSH and LH, and then around day 7, we'll see estrogen levels beginning to rise. Now, estrogen serves two primary purposes. Firstly, it causes uterine lining, also known as endometrium, to grow thicker in preparation for possible pregnancy. Because these endometrial changes are proliferative, this part of the uterine cycle is also called proliferative phase. Secondly, the initial rise in estrogen levels sends a negative feedback signal to the hypothalamic pituitary axis to suppress further production of FSH and LH. In addition to that, granulosa cells of the growing follicles produce another hormone called inhibin, which selectively suppresses FSH secretion. As the follicular phase progresses, out of the multiple large follicles that remain sensitive to decreasing levels of FSH, only a single dominant follicle continues to grow and produce increasing amounts of estrogen. Once again, the lining of the uterus continues to become thicker and spongier with blood-rich tissues. Now, once the estrogen levels reach a critical level as the follicle matures within the ovary, estrogen begins to exert positive feedback on LH production, which provokes a steep surge in LH and to a lesser degree FSH. Around day 14, when LH reaches its peak, it triggers the mature follicle to rupture and release the egg into fallopian tube in a process called ovulation. This marks the end of the follicular phase and the beginning of the second half of the menstrual cycle, called luteal phase. So after ovulation, the follicle cells that used to hold the egg develop into a structure called the corpus luteum. This structure becomes a center for the production of the final key hormone, that is progesterone. Just like estrogen, progesterone helps the uterine lining to become thicker and more vascular. In addition to this, progesterone stimulates glands in the uterine wall to produce fluids necessary for the nutrition of the potential embryo, and it stimulates glands in the cervix to secrete the mucus that closes up the uterine opening and becomes a barrier to sperm and bacteria. For this reason, this phase of the uterine cycle is also called the secretory phase. Now, going back to our graph, during the first few days following ovulation, the corpus luteum secretes high levels of progesterone as well as lower levels of estrogen. This is why the graph shows a steep rise in progesterone and a slight drop in estrogen levels, which peak around day 21. During that same period of time, elevated levels of circulating estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin also exert a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, thereby inhibiting secretion of GnRH, FSH, and LH, which prevents new follicles from developing. Now, if fertilization of the egg does not occur during a short period of time, the corpus luteum will start to break down, causing levels of both estrogen and progesterone to fall dramatically. It is this sudden decline in progesterone and estrogen levels that causes the uterine lining to break down and ultimately come out in the form of menstrual bleeding, also called menses, which marks the start of the next follicular phase. Now that we covered the menstrual cycle, let's move on to the second part of this lecture, that is the pharmacology of hormonal contraceptives. So hormonal contraception refers to birth control methods that act on the endocrine system of the female to prevent ovulation or fertilization. There are two main types of hormonal contraceptives. First is the so-called combined method, which contains synthetic forms of both estrogen and progesterone. And the second is progestin-only method, which contains only progestin, that is a synthetic version of progesterone. Alright, so before we discuss how each of these methods prevent pregnancy, for a reference, let's bring back our chart representing fluctuations of endogenous hormones throughout the normal phases of the menstrual cycle. Now, although hormonal contraceptives come in different forms, such as patches, injections, and vaginal rings, the most widely used form is the oral tablet, also known as the birth control pill. Combination birth control pills come in different formulations, commonly referred to as monophasic and multiphasic. In monophasic formulations, the pills deliver the same amount of estrogen and progestin each day for the first 21 days, followed by 7 days suspension or 7 days of placebo pills. Administration of exogenous estrogen and progestin leads to continuous suppression of LH and FSH output from the pituitary, which results in inhibition of ovulation. The last 7 days of suspension or placebo in turn allow estrogen and progestin levels to fall dramatically, thereby triggering so-called withdrawal bleeding that mimics the normal menstrual cycle. On the other hand, we have multiphasic formulations. In this type of combination birth control, the pills deliver varying levels of estrogen and progestin that intend to mimic the natural hormonal fluctuations, as well as reduce the total exogenous hormone dose per cycle. In addition to this, with the extended cycle contraceptive regimens, women can end their menstrual periods altogether by continuously taking combined estrogen-progestin pills beyond the initial 3 weeks. Lastly, we have progestin-only birth control pills, which are useful for women who don't want long-term hormonal contraception and for whom exogenous estrogen is contraindicated because of breastfeeding or cardiovascular disease. Now, progestin-only pills are taken continuously, with no hormone-free intervals between cycles, leading to consistent suppression of FSH and endogenous progesterone production. That being said, with the exception of intramuscular depot-hydroxyprogesterone, which delivers high dose of progestin, the systemic dose of progestin delivered by all progestin-only products is relatively low. As a result, there is less suppression of endogenous estrogen levels, which allows for occasional LH surge that can trigger ovulation. Instead, progestin-only contraceptives are thought to function primarily by thickening cervical mucus and by causing endometrial atrophy. These changes inhibit egg implantation and make it more difficult for sperm to enter the uterus. Now, to end with some examples of actual drugs used in birth control products, commonly found synthetic derivatives of estrogen are ethinyl estradiol and mestranol, and synthetic derivatives of progesterone are desogestrel, drospirenol, levonorgestrel, norgestrel, norgestimate, and norepinephrine. And with that, I wanted to thank you for watching. I hope you found this video useful, and as always, stay tuned for more.
Okay, so far we've been talking about what happens if pregnancy doesn't occur. I'd like to finish up by talking about, well, what changes if pregnancy does occur. So, if there are sperm in the oviduct when ovulation occurs, and the sperm sperm and egg meet in the oviduct. Then development starts proceeding, and within just a short period of time, the embryo starts producing a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. Human chorionic gonadotropin has a similar effect to LH, and so it stimulates the continued growth of the corpus luteum, so progesterone continues to be secreted, and that maintains the lining of the uterus. Following birth, there's another hormone that's produced called prolactin. Prolactin, though, is inhibited prior to birth by prolactin inhibiting hormone, but after birth, it's released in response to nursing. And prolactin stimulates growth of the glandular tissue in the mammary glands, and it stimulates milk production. And then another hormone that's involved is oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates contractions of the uterus during labor, and it also is released following birth in response to the nursing stimulus. When the newborn starts nursing on the breasts, that stimulates the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin causes what's called the letdown reflex, which is the release of the milk. So prolactin is what stimulates milk production. Oxytocin stimulates the contractions of the uterus during delivery, and also the letdown reflex following birth in response to nursing, which provides milk for the newborn. Human chorionic gonadotropin, that's produced by some of the extraembryonic membranes of the fetus, and that has the same effect as LH, and so it stimulates progesterone synthesis, which maintains the lining of the uterus. HCG, also, by the way, is what is tested for in most pregnancy tests, because high levels of HCG indicate pregnancy. So that's what most pregnancy tests are looking for. So if there's no HCG, then that means that pregnancy hasn't occurred. All right, well, we are about out of time, so I'm sorry about the sound. I tried to get IT to fix it this semester. They didn't do a very good job on it. But you can look at that again on your own, and it should sound better if you look at it on your own device. If you haven't picked up your Scantron form from your family tree, please do that. You too.